Thank you very much. I'm thrilled and overwhelmed by the attendance this evening. It's beautiful. Before I begin, I do want to just make a couple of short introductions. First of all, sitting here is a lady who sits next to me collecting the money at all the Heritage Center events, Connie. And next to her, two over, is my brother Bill. So you'll hear me several times tonight say I or my or me, like maybe I would say my dad. That's our dad. If I say it's my grandfather, that would be our grandfather, and also the grandfather of John Baumgartner, a longtime member of the Historical Society, who's my cousin, our cousin. So, and his wife, Doreen, who will get mentioned at some point. And then in the back, we have one of our secretaries, Colleen, who was so thrilled about helping put together the PowerPoint presentation that she couldn't miss tonight. So, thank you. And also, before I begin, let me just say a couple of thank yous. First of all, thank you, Charlotte, for inviting me to come and tell you, everybody here, a little bit about the history of the family and the history of the law firm. Thanks to Michelle Poe in the back, who is going to do the slide presentation. Hopefully I haven't messed it up on your notes, so you'll know when to come in and put the slides in. And then as Vice President of the Heritage Center Foundation, let me just say thank you to all of you who support both the Historical Society and the Heritage Center Foundation. It's you who keep the memories of Grayslake alive, the memories of my family, the memories of a lot of the families that are in this room as I look around, and there's some families here who should be up here giving the speech tonight. Thank you for keeping those memories alive. This is Grayslake, and this is how Grayslake got started and developed. So, I'm a lawyer in the firm of Churchill, Quinn, Rickman, and Hamilton. We have been on the same corner in downtown Grayslake for 116 years, a little bit of time. And we've always been located on the corner of Center Street and Whitney Street, but not always the same corner. That in a minute. The Grayslake story begins with my great-grandfather, our great-grandfather, Oliver Churchill. The first picture that we have of him is when he and his 5 brothers, when they prepared to go off to fight on behalf of the Union in the Civil War. We believe that this little X over this head indicates that that is Oliver Churchill. We believe it, okay, because that's how the picture came down to us, and we're thinking somebody in the family must have marked that as our ancestor. And also, we have a picture of him in his uniform. This is a picture which has actually been displayed here in the Historical Society. The family was from Vermont, and these brothers were originally assigned to Company C, 11th Regiment of the Vermont Volunteers. I believe that was later incorporated into the 10th, as most of the 11th perished in battle. His assignments led him to the defense of Washington. So if you know your history, that's a particular part of the Civil War, the defense of Washington. Then, after Gettysburg, he was in the company in his regiment, followed Robert E. Lee down the Shenandoah. They fought the Wilderness Campaign, Cold Harbor, and they finished the war at Appomattox Courthouse, where Lee surrendered. I would love to be able to go back and ask my great-grandfather if he was there and had any part of the ceremony when Lee's troops surrendered. I imagine at that point, as just an ordinary soldier, he may not have even understood the significance of that. After the war, and after a brief period back in Vermont, Oliver Churchill headed west, eventually settling in Libertyville, Illinois. Oliver taught school in the winter and was a mechanic, that is, a carpenter, during the summers. He worked on the houses in that fledgling new town of Grayslake and that booming metropolis of Haynesville, which was a bigger town in those days. And he moved there when my grandfather was only 2 years old. Oliver built the house at the corner of Lake and Oak. This is the house which my grandfather and my grandmother moved into And years after they passed, or at the time that they passed, our cousin John Baumgartner took over the house to raise his family. It was a big house then, but nowhere as big as the one that stands there now. It had a grand parlor in the front, in which our grandfather, as the local justice of peace, used to perform weddings. In fact, John Epstein from the Grayslake Jelly Company was married in Grandma and Grandpa's front parlor. And there were a lot of other people around town who were likewise married there. It is believed that great-grandpa Oliver also built or worked on several of the old houses along Lake Street. The house next to Light the Lamp, the one with the white columns, is believed to be one of his constructions that either he did himself or with others. Perhaps there's someone with an older memory than mine that can correct that belief, but that's what we believe. Oliver had a son, Rolla Wilson Churchill, or RW as he liked to be called. He went to a new grade school at the corner of 120 and Lake Street. Now it's known as Westlake Christian Academy. So I need to take just one sidebar here. Bill and I were the third generation to go through that grade school. Bill's kids, Bill Doreen's kids, John Baumgartner's kids were the fourth generation to attend that school. John's mother was a teacher, and John believes that she taught there for a while. And Bill's wife Doreen taught what was then became Lakeview, but when we were growing up, it was just the grade school in town. So, at any rate, I walk in there when I go to something at Westlake Christian Academy, and I look around and go, oh, that's where I did this, and that's where that happened, and that's where so-and-so did such and so. And you go in the gym, and it's like, oh, I learned a square dance in this place. So, it's an interesting reflection to go back into that school. Grandpa finally decided that he was going to become a lawyer, and so he went to Kent College of Law, where he apparently did quite well. Here's a news clip describing an award that he had won. Back in those days, things like that created a lot of news. Then in 1903, Grandpa started his brand new law firm in downtown Grayslake on the corner of Whitney Street and Center Street, which in those days I believe was called Lake Street, not Center Street. At that time, and for several decades after that, I believe that Grandpa was the only lawyer west of Green Bay Avenue in all of Lake County. So it was kind of a pioneering thing to be a lawyer out in western Lake County, and he was the only one. That same year, he married Ethel Wisner. Here's a news clip announcing their marriage. Grandma was from a family that had settled in Lake Villa Township in 1842, only 66 years after the formation of our country. You take 83 and you go up to Monteville Road and you take a west on Monteville, which is the only way you can take. You go across the railroad tracks, all that land on the right there was the Wisner farm, and that's where my grandmother was born and raised. And the house eventually burned down, and the house that's there now is, I think, a little bit bigger, but it's pretty much on the same spot that the original family homestead was there. So our family roots go back in Lake County 180 years. Been around for a while. Grandpa played baseball with the local baseball team. I think this might be a photo that you have here in the Historical Museum. But I think it's just kind of interesting looking at some of these names here. This is Tote Thompson. Here's Fred Battershaw. Battershaw is the name when I grew up. My dad was always talking about the Battershaw family, and that's one of them. This is John Morse. Now, when Bill and I grew up, we had a neighbor just a couple doors down from us by the name of John Morse. His wife, Mrs. Morse, taught kindergarten for 45 years. I think that's the same John Morse. I don't know if I can tie it together. Maybe somebody else in the room might know the answer to that. So, Alan McMillan, a name that I've always remembered when I was a kid. William Brandstetter, There's a name that goes back. My grandfather and George Fredericks, the Fredericks family. So 1950, those were the young boys that played baseball. My grandfather became an officer in the Lake County Republican Party. 60 years later, I became the chairman of the Lake County Republican Party. And both he and I were active. I believe that he actually became a state official in the Republican Party at one point. He was appointed as an assistant attorney general for the state of Illinois. And in one of my favorite pictures, in 1931, a group of the powerhouses of Lake County gathered together for a group picture. Cannot really tell if this is spring, winter, or fall. It's certainly not summer. My grandfather here on the right looks like he was wearing waders. Some of the other guys had like hunting boots on. This gentleman here had a catcher's mitt, so maybe they were playing baseball. But this man here was he was the owner of the Waukegan News-Sun. This man here was Stratton, who became treasurer of the state of Illinois, and his son became a governor. This man here was Block. I believe his son became a judge. Scott was recorder of deeds at the time. Dady and Decker, two of these guys back here, created Dady and Decker subdivision, which is the subdivision on the north side of Gages Lake. And then one of these gentlemen is Edwards. I'm not sure which one. I believe he might have been the one that started Edwards subdivision, which would be over in the Round Lake area. So, and some of the other names, like Braganza is an old name, and Paddock, some of these other names are old names. Hendy, if you know the Depke family, Georgianne Depke was Hendy, so that ties in. So this is, I think really what this was a bunch of the guys that kind of at a certain level in Lake County ran things. And they all decided that they were going to get together for just a little outing. And my grandfather was probably one of the most Western of those, so it may have been that he tagged along just because of the fact that he was known out in the western part of the county, both in politics and in law. In 1953, Grandpa received his life membership for 50 years of practicing law. I look at this picture and I say, look at all those old guys. And then I think about the fact in 3 years I'm one of them. I've been 47 years, so in 3 years I'm going to get that same award that Grandpa got then. Grandma and Grandpa had 4 children, one of them being my father, George Oliver Churchill, Oliver named after great-grandpa, and one being John Baumgartner's mother, Marjorie Baumgartner. A third, Edith King, was a school teacher at Woodland Grade School in Gurnee, and she lived on Harvey with her husband, Robert King. And the fourth, my Aunt Alma, was a professor at Illinois College. RW's descendants would practice law on the same corner, 4 of them. My father, my brother Bill, myself, and my cousin John Churchill Baumgartner. My father was born here in Grayslake. I don't think he ever moved more than a block in his whole life. He went to the same grade school that we all seem to have gone to. There was no high school back in those days, so he chose to go to Libertyville High School. That's my dad as a younger man. Since one didn't need a driver's license in those days, he and some of his classmates drove down to school in Libertyville every day. And my dad had a number of other type of jobs. During the summer, he drove a taxi. He would go to the railroad station to pick up Chicagoans who were coming out here to escape the Chicago heat and to take them and deliver them to their various summer homes around the area. He had a number of other jobs. I remember him talking about in the winter time, they would go over to frozen Round Lake and they would carve out huge ice blocks. They would then load the ice blocks onto refrigerated train cars, not refrigerated, but basically packed, so that those ice blocks could be taken to the city of Chicago and later chipped up into smaller blocks and delivered to people in their houses to put in their ice boxes. long before the days of refrigerators. And he talked about what it was like to pull these blocks off of Round Lake. Dad attended Lake Forest College, and then after college he went to John Marshall Law School. This is a particular picture that I like because in the back here on the window it says John Marshall Law School. So I'm guessing that he had just graduated, he stepped outside and they were going to take his picture and maybe the other pictures. Then this next picture is a picture that's one of my favorites of him. It kind of, to me, speaks the era. It's that Sam Spade, private investigator. So I don't know if that was something everybody did in those days, but I've always enjoyed looking at that picture. He graduated in 1940 and he started to practice with Grandpa. But before he could settle down into the practice of law, he was called away to serve in the Army during World War II. He was trained to do cryptography, and he spent his time during the war in Africa translating top secret messages from the United States and sending them off into other areas of the world, up into Italy and up into France, wherever the messages needed to go. During my father's absence in the war, my busybody grandfather tried to play matchmaker. There was a pretty young lady who had moved into town and was working as a secretary for a local realtor, Louis Bean, we called him, as we call his son, sitting in the back row, Louis Bean, our many-year neighbor and the son of Louis I. Bean, who had employed this pretty young secretary. My grandfather kept looking in at the office to tell her what a wonderful and handsome young son he had, who she would just love to meet when he finally came home from the war. Then he would write to my father talking about this attractive new secretary that was working for Mr. Bean, who he would have to meet when he got home. So each decided that they would not like the other when they met. 1945, my father gets discharged from the Army, and you know the rest of the story, how that Grandpa had to be a really happy guy. He had to work for him. And then in 1947, I came along, then my sister, and then my brother Bill. In 1903, when Grandpa began his practice of law, he took an office above the Merchants and Farmers Bank. This is a photo which you have here in the Historical Society. I remember the steep steps that one had to negotiate to get up to Grandpa's office, and even years later, I wondered how some of his clients actually ever got up to his office, because it was not an easy task. Anybody that had ever been in that building knows those steps were at quite an angle. Then in the early 50s, Louis Bean, the father, built 3 buildings. One for the Grayslake Pharmacy, one for the Ben Franklin, and then he built what we've known as the town's first professional building. So there you see it as it was in those days. He invited Grandpa and Dad to move across the street, which they did. So we had 55 years on the southeast corner of Center and Whitney, and then the left of that, the rest of that, which is 66 years so far, on the southwest corner of Center and Whitney, all that time on the same corner. I vividly remember the day that they moved in. This is a picture of Dad and Grandpa that we have on our wall in the office. I remember the day that they moved. I was probably around 5 years old. I wanted to help move. So I was entrusted in carrying the really important things, like the metal spittoons and the metal ashtrays, the things that would not break if I happened to drop them on my way across the street. I remember carrying one of those ashtrays down the steps. I have this vivid memory of it. I was hanging onto the handrail with one hand as tightly as I possibly could, And having been entrusted with a metal ashtray, I was hanging onto that ashtray for all dear life to make sure that I didn't drop it. I wasn't going to be the one who was going to break that. I still have one of those spittoons under my desk. I think my brother Bill does. And I know in my office I haven't used it. I'm not sure about him. The professional building that Louis Beam built had a front office waiting room, which was for his clients as well as his secretarial pool, mainly for Ollie Stevens, his longtime secretary and bookkeeper. Ollie was the sister of Linnea Oler, who for many years lived on Lake Street, kind of down where the Posca family and the Chalmers family lived, in that section of Lake Street. Then from the entryway, there was a large personal office for Mr. Beam. Next to that was an office where his brother, Bill Beam, sold insurance. And then there was an office for my father, a smaller office for their one secretary, and then the end office was for my grandfather. The back wall of that building that we're in even yet today had a set of steps going down into the basement. A later addition expanded the back wall to its present location. That building was originally built as a fallout shelter. Okay, so this is right after World War II, and with the Cold War coming on, everybody was worried about a nuclear bomb attack. And in fact, I remember, maybe some of you remember, when we were in grade school, not having fire drills, but having bomb drills. And we would go out and put our backs against the wall and sit against the wall and put our legs together and cover our heads. I am sure that that would have stopped the nuclear bomb attack. But nevertheless, it certainly made us cognizant and fearful of what could happen. In that basement were several round cardboard containers filled with survival packages. We kept them there for quite some time. There was no nuclear bomb attack, so we eventually disposed of them. At about the same time as the law firm moved across the street, Mom and Dad had built a new house next to what we in the neighborhood then called, after that called the Chard House. And after Bill's birth, then we moved into this new house. The Chard House, if you go down Park Avenue and you see those two big houses at the end of the street, the one on the right then was occupied by the Chard family, and Mr. Chard became mayor of Grayslake for a number of years. So that's why we affectionately call it the Chard House. We had other neighbors. We had the Hooks, 2 doors down. Billy, Mary, nice to see you. Louis Beam lived across the street. Jim Crofton moved in next to the Hook House. We had just a wonderful neighborhood. It was absolutely nice to be able, I want to tell you this, I'm so happy to have grown up there. It was great. So, on nice days, Grandpa would walk over a block to pick up my dad, and they would walk to the office together, often at lunch and after work. Their walk together was a normal sight. Years later, I had the great pleasure of practicing law for 13 years with my dad, and often we would walk home together at lunchtime to see what Mom had cooked up for us. I think maybe Bill had the same experience from time to time. So, my dad served 16 years on the Avon Township Board. He served on the grade school board. He served on the newly formed Grayslake High School board. He was active in local politics. In fact, one of my first recollections of politicking with my father was going to a campaign rally for Dwight Eisenhower, who was running for president in 1952. You might say, you're 5 years old, how do you remember that? The reason I remember it is that General Omar Bradley came in to speak for Eisenhower, and he came by helicopter. He landed the helicopter on the new Grayslake football field, and they had built some kind of a podium or something for him to come in and give his speech. And so that's where he flew in. One's first sight of a helicopter at age 5 is a memory that one doesn't lose quickly, and I still can picture it today. Dad and Grandpa practiced law together for several years until Grandpa finally had some physical problems and retired. He passed in 1963. About that time, our cousin, John Baumgartner, joined with Dad. John had gone to Illinois College and the University of Michigan Law School, and they named the firm Churchill and Baumgartner. Then in the 1970s, we saw a major expansion of the law firm. I joined in 1972. My roommate from law school, John Phillips, joined in 1976. My brother came in 1977. And a good friend of ours, John Quinn, who had been a chief title examiner at Chicago Title, agreed to quit the title company and come and work for us, and then he came in 1982. John Phillips was eventually elected as a judge and then finished out his career as the chief judge of the 19th Judicial Circuit. So the firm name went from Churchill, Baumgartner, and Phillips to Churchill, Baumgartner, and Quinn. When the Ben Franklin decided to not renew its lease, the Bruner family joined with us to acquire the building from the Bean family. And we took the center portion of it, and the Bruners in their pharmacy took the front section for their cards and the back section for their storage. Front section is now, if you think about when you go into Emil's and you go sit at the, not the high tops in the bar area, but you go in the other area, that would be the front part of that building. 1985, our father finally passed, having practiced law for 45 years. He had been a great font of wisdom. He seemed to know everybody, and he knew all of their family histories. He had distilled much of his wisdom into wonderful one-liners, most of which cannot be spoken in mixed company. We heard them. He exercised a lot of influence in the community, and he helped countless young attorneys learn the trade and succeed. I often meet up with established attorneys today who still fondly recall how they would call my dad when they had a particularly sticky legal problem, and he always had time for them to help them through their problem and make them better lawyers. After his passing, the law firm would continue to grow and thrive. In 2000, at the age of 97 years, a newspaper article celebrating businesses in Grayslake wrote a story about our firm. One of the highlights of the history of our firm was when John Baumgartner, who's in the center of this picture, won a case in the United States Supreme Court. He overturned 40 years of labor law. I think John dedicated a year to that case. He made several trips to Washington, D.C. to do mock hearings in preparation for what would eventually be standing in front of 9 Supreme Court justices defending his position in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. I went with him for that, and I truly believe that I was far more nervous than he was. He was very ready to argue his case. The U.S. Supreme Court only hears about 80 cases a year. So even getting to the U.S. Supreme Court is a major feat. And that is generally celebrated throughout the legal community. This case quickly made all of the case books used in law school. Newspapers around the country carried the story of this case. The Wall Street Journal, the New York Times. Even the press in Puerto Rico called up and wanted to talk to John about this case. In a great irony, even though the plaintiff was from Grayslake and the lawyer was from Grayslake, the only 2 newspapers that didn't carry the story were the Grayslake Times and the Waukegan News-Star. What is it? There's some kind of biblical admonition about preaching in your own hometown. And then in 2003, the firm turned 100 years old. Then Mayor Tim Perry and the village board proclaimed Churchill, Baumgartner, and Quinn Day in Grayslake. Proclamation hangs on our walls as you enter our front door. We had a grand celebration on the night before Grayslake Day, so those days were Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, and we got Thursday night for our celebration. And the mayor, who happens to be the only one in shorts, Tim Perry was the one that awarded us the proclamation and gave a little speech. Leo Delaney, many of you know, this is Mike Guitar, who is now a judge, so he's not practicing with us anymore. John Quinn, Jack Rickman, Bill, Mayor Perry, me, Mark Hamilton, and John Baumgartner. So that's our 100th celebration. A few years later, John Baumgartner retired after 45 years. With the addition of Jack Rickman and Mark Hamilton, the law firm changed its name to what it is today, Churchill, Quinn, Rickman, and Hamilton, Ltd. We continue to grow. Leo Delaney, Mark Van Doncelar, John Quinn's son Jack, Jack Rickman's daughter Jency, and our newest associate, Lisa Wizawati, causes Churchill, Quinn, Rickman, and Hamilton to remain the oldest and also one of the largest law firms based in Lake County. If you come into our front office, you will see this. It's a little tough to see. It's hard to get a picture of that, but that's kind of a history of the firm. 116 years in downtown Grayslake. That seems so long, 116 years. When you think about it, that is just shy of 1/2 of our country's age. So our family has been practicing law in downtown Grayslake for almost half of the history of the United States of America. That puts it in some perspective. Many people know us as the lawyers on the corner. A fact which is not often recognized is that we are also one of Grayslake's larger businesses. We have 10 lawyers and 9 support staff for a total full-time staff of 19. Being a business, we do all the things that normal businesses do. We hire staff, we buy products to run the business, we have customers, we call them clients. We promote our business, including on social media. We make contributions to local community events. We're involved in all of the community events. We maintain a physical location, which every business owner knows requires constant upkeep and maintenance. As a business, we provide legal services to the community. I like to say that we are a reflection of our community. We do the kind of law that local people mostly need. Real estate transactions and probate and estate planning have been the 2 largest segments of our legal practice since Grandpa first started the business in 1903. But we also litigate commercial cases. We represent a lot of the area's small businesses. We do tax appeals. We handle appellate and Supreme Court cases. And we're a reference for a lot of Chicago law firms, something that you wouldn't necessarily think about. But if a large Chicago law firm has a case in Lake County and they don't want to send one of their lawyers up here, they'll employ our firm to co-counsel with them, and then we'll do their local work up here. My grandfather chose to not do divorces, bankruptcy, and criminal law, and we still do not provide legal services in those areas, even though we receive a lot of phone calls for legal representation in those areas. We do maintain a large list of referring attorneys to which we can send our clients who have specific needs. A lot of people know that we are lawyers, but they know we've been around for a long time, but they ask us, who are we? Where might we come into contact with someone from your law firm? So here's just a not so brief, perhaps, list of who we are and who we work. We are that person coaching your kids' sports teams. We're PADS volunteers, lay leaders, deacons of St. Gilbert's, United Protestant, Wildwood Presbyterian, Lakeville United Methodist, and other churches. We're the Grand Knight of the Knights of Columbus, a member of the Grayslake Business Breakfast Group, election judges, director of the Illinois Bar Foundation, Grand Lecturer of the Masons, chairman of the Lake County Republican Party, Chamber of Commerce Director, President of the Exchange Club, Bank and Hospital Directors, Grayslake Police Commissioner, trustees of the grade school board, the high school board, the library board, trustees of several township boards, chairman of the Illinois Economic and Fiscal Commission, member of the Illinois Prisoner Review Board, the parole board, majority leader of the Illinois House of Representatives, 2 judges, including the Chief Judge of the 19th Judicial Circuit, Illinois Assistant Attorney General, Army, Navy, Marine, and Air Force veterans, directors, officers, supporters of the Grayslake Historical Society, Grayslake Heritage Foundation. And there's a long list of other clubs and societies, golf leagues, and private organizations to which the 19 people who are there now and the people who were there before us belong. Each one of us is actively involved in our community, each in our own individual ways. It would be hard to be involved in anything in Grayslake or one of the surrounding communities without crossing paths with someone who spends their working days or has spent their working days at the corner of Whitney and Center. So now I'd just like to conclude this, not so briefly, with an introduction to the people who practice law at Churchill, Quinn, Rickman, and Hamilton. First and foremost, the guy on the top of the letterhead, me. I was always worried about the top of the letterhead because it seemed like for a while the people on the top of the letterhead died. I wasn't really trying to get to that point, but during my 47 years with the firm, I had a great fortune to spend 20 of those years in the state legislature. I rose to the rank of the majority leader of the Illinois House, a position that had once been held by Abraham Lincoln. And I would just want to add to that during the time that I was a majority leader, we had a balanced budget and our pensions were in good shape. Subsequent to that time, everything went to hell in a handbasket. So you'll see some of the areas of law that I practice. And if you go through each one of the people, you'll see that the vast majority of us write wills for people, and we do estate planning, some more sophisticated, some not so sophisticated. Most of us will do real estate transactions from time to time. The litigators usually don't get involved in that, but you know, everybody, those are basics of the law firm, and so you'll see that on pretty much all of our resumes here. In addition, I do a lot of the business formation and making the new corporations and things like that. Next is my brother Bill, and Bill basically specializes in real estate transactions. He does estate planning also. But anything, if you have a complicated real estate transaction, particularly a complicated commercial real estate transaction in Lake County, you're probably going to end up seeing Bill on one side or the other of that equation. And I often have to turn to him to ask him questions, and that's because he's an expert. The next slide is John Quinn. John Quinn is our chief litigator in the office, and he kind of directs the litigation of some of the other lawyers, depending on what kind of cases come up, and he does a lot of business and commercial disputes. If we have disputes over trusts, he'll be involved in that, does mechanics liens, collections, breaches of contract. He's in court most every day. Next, Jack Rickman, someone on the Heritage Foundation, I believe the Historical Society would know. He's been on, I think, both boards, if I'm not mistaken. Jack is our chief guy to go into court on probate matters whenever we have a probate case, and particularly if there's probate litigation where we have people fighting over things in probate, then Jack is the guy that will take that. He also does guardianships. We do a lot of guardianships through the office. I think we may be one of the few law firms around that actually does that. Next, Mark Hamilton does a lot of commercial transactions, represented several big banks in the area for years, and does a fair amount of real estate. Next, Leo Delaney basically does a lot of real estate. He is kind of our Saddlebrook expert, handles most of our Saddlebrook transactions. He has a way of getting over there and getting things done that sometimes seems hard to believe. And he practices in several areas. Next, Mark Van Donselaar is a litigator, and he is involved in a lot of mechanics lien cases, collections, breaches of contract, but he also does real estate tax appeals. So we'll take in a real estate tax appeal case, and if we can get the tax amount lowered, then we just take some small percentage of what you've saved So it's a no-brainer, really. You're gonna save money, and we're gonna make a little money off of it, and in the long run, your bill will stay lower for a longer period of time. So he's made a specialty of that. John Quinn's son, Jack, does a lot of litigation. He is the one that writes all of our appeals. He loves to do research. A lot of times I come in the morning, there'll be cases after cases at the photocopy machine, and he's stayed up late the night before getting legal cases to write his appeals. Jack Rickman has a daughter, Jency, who is rather new in the firm. She'll be taking a little time off very quickly. July 4th, I think her baby is due. So unfortunately, some of these pictures were very recent, but so Jency is really helping her dad on estate planning and spends time in court on probate. And then our newest associate, Lisa Wizawati's only been there for 2 months, so we're kind of putting her into the areas of their standard practice areas for us. And at some point, we've all been able to say, you know, I really like doing this area of the law, I'm going to take off and do that. And as long as we have clients that really want us in those areas, then, you know, then that's something we're going to find as a fit. So maintaining a business over a long period of time is a difficult task. That is why there are not a lot of businesses that survive 100 years. If you think that that's hard, doing it over several generations of family is even more difficult. And it's really a rare thing to find a business that's 3 generations or more. But as you can see, we have a few descendants in the new generation. And so it's our hope that they're going to be able to lead our law firm through this second century and to the year 200, to our 200th birthday. I think if we ever get to that point, we'll see a big smile coming out of heaven from Grandma and Dad. So that ends my my remarks. I hope I didn't put anybody to sleep. Thank you ever so much for being so patient and kind. Thank you.
Any questions? Comments? Tomatoes?
Only if they're edible.